There exist chapters in our lives that defy the emotional extremes we've grown accustomed to discussing. We speak endlessly about heartbreak and euphoria, about rage and bliss, but we rarely acknowledge those peculiar stretches of time when the heart simply stops speaking. When the internal orchestra that usually accompanies our days falls into an unexpected profound quiet. This isn't the dramatic collapse that movies portray, nor is it the theatrical emptiness that literature often romanticizes. This is something far more ordinary, and paradoxically, far more unsettling. It's the experience of waking up one morning and realizing that your emotional landscape has become remarkably flat, like a painting where all the colors have somehow faded to the same muted shade. Picture yourself sitting in a familiar space. Perhaps your bedroom, perhaps a coffee shop you've visited hundreds of times. The world around you continues its usual rhythm. People laugh, music plays, conversations flow. Yet you find yourself observing all of this as if through a thick pane of glass. You can see the joy, you can recognize the sadness, you can identify the excitement in others, but these emotions feel impossibly distant from your own experience. This is not sadness wearing a disguise. Sadness has weight, has texture, has a voice that demands attention. This is something else entirely, a peculiar suspension where your emotional responses seem to have taken an indefinite leave of absence. You find yourself going through the motions of appropriate reactions, laughing when something is funny because you intellectually recognize the humor, expressing concern when someone shares bad news because you understand that concern is the expected response. But beneath these performed emotions lies a strange void, a space where your authentic feelings used to live, but now seem to have retreated to some unreachable corner of your psyche. What makes this experience particularly isolating is how effectively it hides itself. Unlike depression, which often announces itself through obvious changes in behavior, emotional numbness can masquerade as perfect functionality. You complete your work assignments, maintain your relationships, respond to messages, attend social gatherings. To the outside world, you appear not just fine, but perhaps even more composed than usual. Yet inside, you're navigating a landscape that feels fundamentally altered. It's as if someone has adjusted the contrast settings on your internal world, leaving everything technically visible but somehow drained of its former vibrancy. The things that once sparked excitement now feel distant and academic. The experiences that used to generate strong opinions now seem oddly irrelevant. Even the people you care about most feel like characters in a movie you're watching rather than active participants in your lived reality. This emotional flatlining often emerges not during life's most dramatic moments, but during its most mundane ones. It's not the sudden death of a loved one, or the end of a significant relationship that triggers it, though these events certainly can. More often, it's the accumulated weight of countless smaller pressures, the demanding job that never quite lets up, the family responsibilities that seem to multiply without warning, the social expectations that require constant performance, the general uncertainty that has become the backdrop of modern adult life. Your mind, in its infinite wisdom, recognizes that you've been operating at an unsustainable emotional altitude for too long. Rather than allowing you to crash completely, it implements what can only be described as an advanced protection protocol. It doesn't shut down your ability to function. That would be too disruptive to your daily survival. Instead, it quietly dims the emotional volume, creating enough distance between you and your feelings so that you can continue moving forward without becoming overwhelmed. This is not a malfunction of your psychological system. It's actually evidence of its sophisticated design. Your mind has essentially decided that you've been carrying too much emotional weight for too long, and rather than allowing that weight to crush you, it has temporarily redistributed the load. The feelings are still there, but they're being held in a kind of psychological storage unit, while your conscious mind gets a chance to rest and recalibrate. But here's where the experience becomes truly complex. This emotional distance, while protective, can also become profoundly lonely. It's a unique form of isolation because you're not alone in any external sense. You're surrounded by people, engaged in activities, participating in life. Yet there's an invisible barrier between you and the full experience of these interactions. You can see warmth, but you can't quite feel it. You can recognize love, but it doesn't quite penetrate. You can observe beauty, but it doesn't quite move you. Many people in this state begin to question their own character. They wonder if they're becoming cold, if they're losing their capacity for empathy, if something fundamental about their personality is changing. But this self-doubt reveals a crucial misunderstanding about the nature of emotional numbness. The capacity for feeling hasn't disappeared. It's simply been placed in temporary protective custody. Think of it this way: when your body experiences physical trauma, it can go into shock, temporarily shutting down non-essential functions to preserve energy for survival. Emotional numbness operates on a similar principle. When your psyche has been pushed beyond its comfortable limits for an extended period, it can enter a kind of emotional shock, temporarily muting your feeling responses to conserve psychological energy. This conservation mode can be triggered by various factors. Sometimes it's the result of chronic stress, those months or years when life feels like an endless series of challenges that must be navigated without pause. Sometimes it stems from emotional overwhelm, periods when you've absorbed so much intensity from your environment that your system needs a break from processing feelings altogether. Sometimes it develops as a learned response to environments where emotional expression felt unsafe or unwelcome. Consider someone who grew up in a household where showing vulnerability led to dismissal or mockery. In such an environment, the young mind learns that emotions are liabilities rather than valuable sources of information. Over time, the psychological system becomes highly skilled at suppressing emotional responses before they can fully form. This suppression can become so automatic that the person may not even realize they're doing it. Years later, when faced with situations that would naturally evoke strong feelings, the same suppression mechanism activates. The adult finds themselves feeling oddly detached from experiences that should be emotionally significant, job promotions that should feel exciting, relationship conflicts that should feel upsetting, losses that should feel devastating. The emotions are generated, but they're intercepted before they can reach conscious awareness. But emotional numbness isn't always rooted in past experiences. Sometimes it's a direct response to present circumstances. When life becomes excessively predictable, demanding, or overwhelming, the emotional system can shift into what might be called energy conservation mode. It's as if your psyche recognizes that you're operating with limited emotional resources and decides to ration them carefully. This rationing can happen gradually, so slowly that you might not notice the shift until you're fully immersed in it. One day you realize that you haven't felt genuinely excited about anything in months. You notice that situations which would normally provoke strong reactions now barely register on your emotional radar. You find yourself going through the motions of caring without actually experiencing the feeling of caring. What's particularly striking about this phenomenon is how it affects not just your relationship with your own emotions, but also your connection to the emotions of others. Many people experiencing emotional numbness find that they can still recognize and respond appropriately to other people's feelings, sometimes even more sensitively than usual. It's as if the energy that was once directed toward processing their own emotional experiences gets redirected toward understanding and supporting others. This can create a strange paradox where someone feeling emotionally numb becomes known as an especially good listener, a reliable source of comfort, someone who never seems to be overwhelmed by drama or crisis. Friends and family may increasingly turn to them during difficult times, not realizing that this apparent emotional stability is actually a form of protective detachment. The numb person finds themselves in the peculiar position of being emotionally unavailable to themselves while remaining emotionally present for everyone else. They can offer comfort, advice, and support, but they struggle to access their own needs, desires, and reactions. They become expert at reading the emotional weather around them while losing touch with their own internal climate. This external focus can serve as both a distraction from and a substitute for authentic emotional engagement. Rather than confronting the strange emptiness within themselves, they can pour their energy into helping others navigate their emotional complexities. It's a way of staying connected to the world of feelings without having to directly experience their own. But this approach, while temporarily sustainable, eventually reveals its limitations. The person may begin to feel like they're living their life at one remove, experiencing everything secondhand through other people's emotions. They might start to wonder if they're losing their ability to have authentic relationships, if they're becoming more of an emotional service provider than a genuine friend or partner. These concerns often lead to what could be called emotional performance anxiety, a fear that their numbness is somehow visible to others, that people will notice their lack of authentic response and judge them as cold or disconnected. This anxiety can actually deepen the numbness, creating a cycle where the fear of not feeling enough makes it even harder to access genuine emotions. The truth is that emotional numbness exists on a spectrum. For some people, it's a temporary state that lasts weeks or months before naturally resolving. For others, it becomes a more persistent condition that requires deliberate attention and care to address. For still others, it becomes a familiar refuge that they return to during stressful periods, a psychological safe house they can retreat to when the outside world becomes too intense. Understanding where you fall on this spectrum requires honest self-reflection about your relationship with emotions throughout your life. Have you always been someone who feels things deeply, making your current numbness feel particularly foreign and concerning? Or have you noticed a pattern of emotional withdrawal during challenging periods, suggesting that this might be a regular coping mechanism for you? Neither pattern is inherently problematic, but each requires a different approach to understanding and potentially addressing. The person who typically feels deeply may need to focus on identifying what specific stressors or circumstances triggered their current state of detachment. The person who regularly cycles through periods of emotional withdrawal may benefit from examining the underlying patterns that make this coping mechanism feel necessary. One of the most important things to understand about emotional numbness is that it's not a permanent alteration to your personality or emotional capacity. The feelings haven't been destroyed or permanently damaged. They've been temporarily placed in protective storage. This distinction matters enormously because it affects how you approach your relationship with your current state. If you believe that your numbness represents a fundamental change in who you are, you're likely to feel hopeless and passive about your situation. But if you understand it as a temporary protective measure implemented by a healthy, adaptive psychological system, you can approach it with curiosity and patience rather than alarm and self-judgment. This reframe doesn't mean that emotional numbness is pleasant, or that it should be simply accepted without question. The experience of feeling disconnected from your own emotional life can be deeply unsettling and can interfere with your ability to make decisions, form meaningful connections, and experience satisfaction in your daily activities. But understanding it as a protective rather than pathological response can help you work with your psychological system rather than against it. The path back to emotional availability often begins with creating the conditions that make feeling safe again. This might mean addressing external stressors that contributed to the numbness in the first place, reducing overwhelming responsibilities, setting better boundaries with demanding people, creating more stability in your daily routine. But it also means addressing your internal relationship with emotions themselves. Many people experiencing numbness have developed, often unconsciously, the belief that emotions are dangerous, untrustworthy, or burdensome. They may have learned through experience that showing feelings leads to complications, that having needs creates problems, that being vulnerable invites hurt. These beliefs, while perhaps based on real past experiences, can keep the emotional system locked in protective mode, even when the external circumstances that originally justified this protection have changed. Reconnecting with your emotional life often requires a gradual process of rebuilding trust, not just with other people, but with your own capacity to handle whatever feelings might emerge. This process can't be rushed or forced. Emotions, like wild animals, respond better to patient invitation than to aggressive pursuit. Many people make the mistake of trying to jumpstart their emotional system by seeking out intense experiences, dramatic movies, challenging adventures, complicated relationships. But for someone whose emotional system has gone into protective mode, intensity can actually trigger further shutdown. Instead, the return to feeling often happens through small, gentle experiences that don't overwhelm the already cautious psychological system. This might mean spending time in nature and noticing small moments of beauty. It might mean listening to music that once moved you and paying attention to any subtle stirrings of response. It might mean engaging in creative activities that allow for expression without requiring specific emotional content. It might mean having conversations with trusted people who don't demand emotional performance but simply offer presence and acceptance. The physical body often plays a crucial role in this reconnection process. Emotional numbness frequently involves a disconnection, not just from feelings but from physical sensations as well. Practices that help you reconnect with your body. Gentle exercise, mindful breathing, massage, warm baths, spending time in sunlight can help restore the pathways between physical sensation and emotional experience. It's also worth noting that the return of emotions doesn't always happen in the way people expect. Rather than a dramatic breakthrough, where all feelings suddenly return in full force, it's more common to experience a gradual thawing. You might notice that you feel slightly more interested in things you used to enjoy. You might find yourself having a stronger reaction to something beautiful or moving. You might realize that a conversation affected you more deeply than you initially recognized. These small shifts are worth paying attention to and celebrating, even if they feel minor compared to the full emotional engagement you remember from before. They're signs that your protective mechanisms are beginning to relax, that your psychological system is starting to believe it's safe to feel again. But it's important to approach this process with patience and self-compassion. Emotional numbness often develops in response to real challenges and stressors, and it may have served an important protective function during a difficult period of your life. Judging yourself for having experienced it, or putting pressure on yourself to get over it quickly, can actually interfere with the natural recovery process. Instead, try to view your numbness with the same compassion you would offer to a friend going through a difficult time. Recognize that your psychological system was doing its best to protect you under challenging circumstances. Appreciate the strength it took to keep functioning even when your emotional resources were depleted. Acknowledge that the path back to full emotional engagement may take time, and that's perfectly normal and acceptable. Remember that emotional numbness, while challenging, is also a testament to your resilience. It represents your mind's sophisticated ability to adapt to difficult circumstances, to find ways of continuing forward, even when the usual sources of motivation and meaning feel temporarily inaccessible. This adaptability is actually a sign of psychological health, not dysfunction. As you move through this experience, try to stay connected to the parts of yourself that remain accessible. You may not be able to feel excitement, but you can still recognize beauty. You may not be able to access deep sadness, but you can still offer comfort to others. You may not be able to feel passionate about your goals, but you can still take care of your basic needs and responsibilities. These maintained capacities are not just consolation prizes while you wait for your real emotions to return. They're evidence that your core self remains intact beneath the temporary numbness. They're proof that you haven't lost your essential humanity or your ability to connect with the world around you. The experience of emotional numbness, while difficult, can also offer unexpected insights into the nature of feelings themselves. When emotions are temporarily muted, you may become more aware of how much of your usual experience is colored by emotional responses you typically take for granted. You might notice how much energy goes into processing and responding to feelings, and develop a new appreciation for the complexity of your emotional system. You might also discover strengths and capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Many people experiencing numbness find they have more capacity for logical thinking, for making decisions based on practical considerations rather than emotional impulses, for remaining calm in situations that would normally provoke strong reactions. While these shouldn't be seen as preferable to emotional engagement, they can be valuable resources during challenging times. The key is to view this period not as a failure or a loss, but as a different way of being in the world, one that, while temporary and not necessarily chosen, can still offer its own forms of learning and growth. Your emotional system will likely return to its full capacity when the conditions are right, but in the meantime, you can still live meaningfully and maintain important connections. Trust in your psychological system's wisdom. Trust that this protective numbness serves a purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately clear. Trust that your capacity for feeling remains intact beneath the temporary quiet. And trust that with patience, self-compassion, and appropriate support if needed, you can navigate this experience and eventually find your way back to the full spectrum of human emotion. The silence in your heart is not emptiness. It's rest. It's preparation. It's your mind's way of saying that you've been strong enough, have carried enough, have felt enough for now, and that it's okay to simply be still while you gather the resources you need for whatever comes next.